well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our second session, which we're actually seeing out of order of Tennessee 101, the history of Tennessee arts and crafts. My name is Jennifer Cloar. I'm the executive director of the Tennessee Historical Society, and I'm joined tonight by Nikki Ward, my coworker. And just a brief introduction here, and then we'll get our lecture started. We have two upcoming webinars in the new year. This is our last one of 2024. So in January 2025, I will be speaking along with my co-author, Janet Hassan, about Tennessee samplers. And then in February, we'll be having a session on Black Bodies Making Form, which is a traveling exhibit that encompasses 100 years of African-American arts and crafts in Tennessee. So you won't want to miss those. You can go ahead and register for them. You can go to our programs page and look for the Tennessee 101 Arts and Crafts logo. And then from there, you can navigate to each page devoted to each session and register from there. Now, we do post the recordings of the sessions after the fact. So if you miss something, you can always go to that page and see the video down there at the bottom. Tonight, if you have a question, we invite you to drop it into the Q&A box. We'll be putting some links in there for you as well, some resources that will let you expand your knowledge of Carroll Cloar. Follow us on social media. That's the best way to find out about the programs that we offer, and there are all of our handles there. And we do want to thank our sponsors for this series, the Tennessee Arts Commission. They make the work that we do here possible. All right, so now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. And let me pull up my cheat sheet of notes here. Dr. Stanton Thomas is a chief curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg, Florida. And while he was a curator at the Memphis Museum of Art, he mounted a retrospective of the art of Carroll Cloar, and he authored the accompanying catalog to it. And Nikki's going to put a link for the catalog in there if you wish to order that. He holds a PhD in art history from Case Western Reserve University, and he's spent quite a bit of time researching Carroll Cloar, and he's going to share that knowledge with us tonight. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Stanton.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining me. Carroll Cloar, it's such a great topic, and his art, his life is really one of my passions. So it's really my pleasure to talk to you a little bit this evening about my interpretation, my thoughts on Carroll Cloar. Let me share screens here, and we will get started. And let me know if that's okay. Are we good? Is that working for everybody?
Looks great.
Okay,
yes.
Fantastic. I'm sorry?
We can see it. Go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. So originally this talk was something I was scheduled to give in October, but unfortunately October, at least for me, was marred by the arrival of two hurricanes within 3 weeks of one another. So I lost pretty much all communication. So y'all were very gracious in allowing me to push this off until December. But that means, of course, that I had really planned on a talk for something for the season of the witch, for the season of Halloween. And this talk was called Ghosts, Paints, and the Otherworldly in the Work of Carroll Cloar. And since I'm now in probably second Sunday of Advent or something for the Christmas season, I'm referring to this as the Nightmare Before Christmas. And to start off, the very first slide you see is actually a work by Carroll Cloar. It's kind of the Nightmare Before Christmas. If you asked for a Carroll Cloar and you got this, you probably wouldn't be very pleased. This is one of his abstract works, but it's a fascinating type of painting he did. And as we go through this talk, you'll see why it's so important. Now, just to make sure that this is at least somewhat Christmassy, I put a couple of images in here associated with the Christmas season because I thought they'd be interesting from the point of, understanding Carroll Cloar's work. One of his most familiar associated with the Christmas season is this one, Gathering Red Haws for the Christmas Tree from 1965. This is a really beautiful image of something that I remember as a child. I would have called this sparkleberry. Sometimes I guess we called it red haw. But the one thing I never did was what they're doing, and it seems that they are actually picking the berries off and putting them in a basket. I'm assuming so this is so they can maybe string them on thread and put them on the tree like cranberries. I don't think you can eat. I know you can't eat red haw, but nonetheless, it's a really nice Christmas image, and kind of gets you in a Cloar state of mind and reminds you that he was somebody who was really devoted to the landscape of the Arkansas Delta, as well as kind of the tri-state region. Now, moving on, another one of his kind of Christmas images is this one. And unfortunately, I only have it in black and white. This painting's in a private collection. I've seen it in color, though, and it's really beautiful blues and kind of silvery lavenders. And it's a painting that really is actually about the Christmas season. And Cloar told a little story about it, and he was pretty vague as to where it happened, but it tells the story of a family people, everyday people who are just walking along the road to a little church where they were going to worship for the Christmas season. And as they were walking along, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came music, just beautiful music. It lasted only a little while, and then it disappeared. And I wanted to include this image not only because of its association with Christmas, but also because one of the things I think is so interesting in understanding Cloar is the environment in which he lived. And this is the environment of about 100 years ago. He was born in 1913, where there was no print advertising, or not very much print advertising. There was certainly nothing digital. There were certainly sounds, but it's not the barrage of media that we're subjected to. And he also lived in a really rural area. And I always remind myself, I grew up in a very rural, kind of remote area. The night was so beautiful and open, but it was also a little bit frightening. And you were much more attuned to watching the stars, watching the shift of light from the moon. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we look a little further at the work of Carroll Cloar. Now, this is a painting which is in the Brooks Museum and one of the iconic works of Carroll Cloar. And I don't immediately think of Christmas, or at least I didn't used to, because it's really about his father, who always talked about he thought he was the biggest man in the world. And when he would go back someday, he would measure him against a tree because he was convinced he was as tall as a tree. But the reason I include this here is I spent a lot of time talking to Pat Cloar Milstead, Carroll Cloar's widow, and she said that the reason Carroll Cloar looks so dour there, and you can see he's the little boy in that kind of car, and his face looks very dour. And the reason I bring it up here is because, according to her, the reason he looks so cranky about it is that is not the car he wanted from the Sears Roebuck catalog, and it's instead a car he got, and he kind of had to put up with it, but it wasn't what he wanted. So I thought that was kind of a funny anecdote related to Carroll Cloar at Christmas. Now, moving on, and really to the topic of this talk, is the place of the otherworldly, the spiritual, the haunts, the ghosts, and things like that in the life of Carroll Cloar. And I wanted to start off with some of his lithographs and a couple paintings because there are several important things to keep in mind. First of all, one of the things that we tend to forget is how close death was to people during that time period. Again, it's 100 years ago. My daughter recently had the croup, and I didn't realize until recently that the croup could have killed you. A lot of times it was a predecessor to diphtheria. And during that time period, where there weren't quite the same measures of sanitation or quite the same medical treatment, death was around you all the time. And this is one of Cloar's many lithographs he made based upon his childhood. This is an image of his mother. It's a posthumous image. She and her husband, his father and mother, both died within several weeks of one another when Cloar was 16. So he understood death and immediate death. And then in the background, kind of floating above his mother's shoulder, is a little image of a girl, and she looks kind of ghostly. This is probably one of the two daughters. There was a daughter older than Carroll Cloar and a daughter younger than Carroll Cloar, his sisters, both of whom died while Cloar was still a child. So here, the song is, of course, um, I guess that shows, in the golden by and by. And it talks about, I'm going to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there ye may also be. So again, reminding us that death was all around them. And there's a lot of images in the work of Carroll Cloar that deal with death, particularly of children and immediate death out in the country. Oops. Another one, for instance, is the death of Monk Carter. And one of the things that was really fascinating for me working on the Cloar project 14 years ago, and still, because I still research on it occasionally, is finding out these are real people. These aren't, little folk tales he heard, but these were people he knew. And in this case, Monk Carter died in 1923, as you can see. So Cloar himself would have been about 10 years old when he died. And this is the image you see on the screen is the image Cloar made of it, of him falling from the tree. I don't know that Cloar saw him fall from the tree. At any rate, though, he knew about it. And on the other side of the screen is the death certificate, which says very clearly, fall from tree. And again, this really makes me realize how often Cloar was exposed to death and how much it really affected his work. Another painting, one of my favorites, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is the lightning that struck roof of Barcliff. Um, Cloar's world was kind of divided, or at least his parents' world was divided between cotton farming and logging. And we tend to forget that that part of the Arkansas Delta, which is now just open fields, was heavily forested. And a lot of people were in the lumber industry. And this is another one of those instances where Cloar was keenly aware of someone being struck by lightning and dead. And you can see here he's made into this incredibly compelling drawing, or excuse me, painting, where the lightning coming down kind of echoes the suggestion of the trees taking on this really beautiful otherworldly effect. And then that brings us even closer to what I really wanted to explore, which is the otherworldly in the work of Cloar. And I just smile every time I see this image because I think it's so charming. This is another one of Cloar's lithographs, this time from 1947, entitled Brother Henson and His Friends. And you can see Brother Henson, who seems to be hugging himself, and he's between these two beautiful angels who look like they stepped out of a 1930s movie or pageant or something. And then above them, there's this light and this kind of heavenly host. This was a real person he depicted. This was a man by the name of Jefferson Benjamin Henson. He lived in Crittenden County with the rest of the Cloar family. As you can see, he passed away in 1955. And in his obituary, it says, Mr. Jeff Henson was a preacher and had dreams and revelations. And you can imagine how Cloar was taken with that idea and made this beautiful image based upon, I'm assuming, conversations he had with Mr. Henson or maybe family members that shows Mr. Henson again, flanked by these angelic creatures. It's a very positive, very beautiful image. And actually, to me, it looks like the front of a Christmas card. However, Brother Henson also had darker visions, stranger visions. And this, to me, is really important in understanding Cloar. And that brings us to Brother Henson's interview with death from around 1940, also lithograph. And this is kind of a terrifying image. I also look at it every time and think, I have a personal trainer and my body is never going to look as good as death's. Well, his head doesn't look great, but the rest of his physique is pretty trim. Uh, this is a fascinating image to me because, obviously this is a man in bed approached by the figure of death who seems to be checking his pulse, or maybe he's ready to drag him out of bed towards death. But you'll notice that Brother Henson is sitting in bed, and right above him, the bed frame kind of forms a halo. I'm sure this was no accident on the part of Cloar. And more than that, you have heavenly light and these kind of heavenly creatures streaming in from the upper right. So it seems very clear that Brother Henson here is going to be redeemed. I love that this takes place again in a very simple house in the Delta with just a screen window in the background. You can imagine the very simple life that even the wealthier families like the Cloars lived. But this is also a very complicated image in other ways because Carroll Cloar certainly was a great visionary, but he also looked at a lot of other types of art from earlier periods. And this really touches upon what I initially studied and what my PhD is in, which is Northern Renaissance art. And here we see, just by way of comparison, the work of Master E.S., who was a German artist who was active in the 15th century. This is one of his engravings. This is the Temptation of Despair, which is one of the seven deadly sins, from the Ars Moriendi, or the art of dying well. Now, this is not something that Cloar owned himself. These prints are very rare, but it's something that Cloar would have been familiar with because they're really major icons in the history of art. And also, Cloar was very well traveled. And I think you can see the comparison pretty easily here. You have the dead man in bed, and then you have these demons kind of dragging and picking at him. Now, the Ars Moriendi were written to help you die well. It helped you get ready for the presence of Christ, and it helped you really kind of cleanse your soul. And I think that Cloar probably was looking at this, but he was also looking at something else. And that almost certainly was the work of Hieronymus Bosch. Now, here we're looking at, again, Brother Hinson, um, and in comparison is a detail from the work of Hieronymus Bosch of Death and the Miser. And then over at far right, you can see the whole panel. It's an altarpiece panel, which is the National Gallery of Art. In this case, we have someone who's on his deathbed in both cases, but I think what's very clear here is Cloar has looked to this for an example of how to depict death as this really grotesque cadaverous creature. And also you notice that the old man, the miser, who has an angel behind him who's kind of propping him up and gesturing upwards, has this light streaming down. In this case, it's the light of Jesus Christ, who appears as a crucified image at the upper left of the detail. And I point this out because Cloar's work, although it seems very simple and very folky, is actually extremely complicated and extremely sophisticated. And it shows that he really was attracted to these other types of art, and that he was able to use these and mold them into something to give even greater power to his images of life in the Arkansas Delta and the tri-state area. Now, moving on, this brings us to yet another image that I think is associated with Brother Hinson, although the title is Brother Hensley, and I'm sorry this image is in black and white, which really stinks. I couldn't get a color image of this either. It's also a very beautiful bluish image, and it shows Brother Hensley, or probably Brother Hinson, wrestling an angel on a road at nighttime, and you see that beautiful starry sky above them. Now, this is taken directly from the book of Genesis. And Cloar, in this case, mentioned that Brother Hensley seemed to be getting the slightly better of it in the wrestling between him and the angel. And he also notes that I am interested only in the visual aspects and nothing else. And that's because Cloar, although he went to a lot of church as a child, while his parents were still living, his mother sometimes went to church twice a day. Sometimes she usually went to Gibson Bayou Church in the morning and then went to Lewis School, where they had another church like a mile up the road in the afternoon. But it seems pretty clear later on in his life he was not a believer. He always respected other people's faiths. So I think that even here, fairly early on in his life, in 1960, he's no longer interested in the religious aspect, and yet he's still really interested in using these kind of biblical images and other people's images based upon biblical tales to help mold his own vision. Now, moving on, I wanted to point out that once again, Cloar was probably looking at the work of another artist. A lot of times when we look at Cloar's work, we see his relationship to photography because he often took photographs and reworked them into paintings. But I think in this case, he was probably looking at the work of Gustave Doré, the great French illustrator, or maybe another one of the French artists of the 19th century. And that's where he came up with this idea of these massive wings and this kind of energetic exchange between these two figures. So one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is Cloar's really kind of continual interest in finding new source material, refining the new source material, again, into these really compelling and complicated images that deal with the Delta and life in the rural South. Now that brings us to ghosts. Did Cloar ever portray ghosts? And as a matter of fact, he did. And once again, I'm sorry that this is a black and white image. It's the only one I could find for it. This is one of Cloar's earliest surviving works. It dates to 1949. It's a beautifully completed painting. I have seen this in the private collection where I'm assuming it still is. It's very rich, very beautiful in its color. And one of the things that hopefully you can see on your screens is right near the center, right near the railroad tracks, there's kind of the ghostly figure of a little girl. And then right behind that, there's more kind of ghostly figures. And this is a richly textured panel. You can see how the the abandoned depot is kind of peeling paint. That effect, though, is something which kind of is scattered throughout the entire panel, throughout the entire painting. And kind of bleeding through that are these images of ghosts. And it's almost as if Cloar was looking at that abandoned railroad station and imagining all the people who had ever walked through it. And so you get this wonderful layered, really rich, very nuanced effect of these kind of ghostly figures who are fading in and out, just visible and very, very evocative. And I think that was something that intrigued Cloar because, of course, later on, he plays with this a little bit more. And that brings me to maybe one of the top 10 paintings that I have of in my mind when I think of Cloar, and that's, of course, Angel in a Thorn Patch from 1957. Now, there's no ghost in this painting, though I would argue very strongly that it's a very ghostly painting. This, of course, is the monument for George Washington Berry, who was a freed African American slave who, after the Civil War, was able to amass incredible wealth, incredible property right near the Cloar family farm. And when he passed away, his family put up this absolutely glorious monument, which is just a little further south down the road towards Earl from the Cloar family farm. And again, this is not a ghost, but it's kind of a ghostly image. And this was an image that always intrigued me because it was so beautiful with this cobalt sky and these kind of gilded brambles in the foreground. And I was very lucky the first time I ever saw this actual site, and it is very much a real site. You can travel there. Here's a shot of it on a sunny day. But when I traveled there the very first time, it was a March day. It had been raining all day, and it had cleared off finally. And I was driving along, and it was the first time I'd ever seen the Angel and Thorn Patch, the actual location. And as I drove along, the sky in the far west suddenly cleared, and the sun was setting. It kind of aligned perfectly. And then for just a couple of moments, the thorn bushes, the brambles around the monument turned that kind of reddish gold, that gilded color. The angel was illuminated, and in the background, the skies were that kind of rich cobalt blue. Didn't last very long, but I think well, I was very lucky to see it because it made me realize perhaps even more strongly than before, how connected Cloar was to the magic realist movement. And that is a very loosely organized movement of artists in the United States who looked at the mundane world, the everyday world, and they looked for the strange and mysterious, the kind of otherworldly aspects of it. A lot of times these images are about experiences which are fleeting, like my experience with the angel in the field, and they're more about feeling than they are about reality. So this is one of my favorite kind of ghostly images, but let's go back to the question of anyone who was painting ghosts during this time period or cemeteries. And it turns out there were quite a few of them. We're going to look at Gibson bioanthology in just a moment, but you'll notice that there's also a major artist and one that Cloar knew, Morris Graves, who has this very beautiful Memorial Day wildflower bouquet in a cemetery from 1936. Down at lower left, we have Lamar Baker's There's a Man Gone Round Taking Names, Negro Spiritual #2 from 1943, and then Andrew Wyeth's In Perpetual Rest from 1960. So Cloar was not unique in his fascination with this kind of macabre, this kind of otherworldly, this fascination with cemeteries. There was something going around. Now, all of these artists were, in one way or another, connected to magical realism. So they probably were out looking for the strangeness of the everyday world. And of course, cemeteries are good places are for that. But it's really more about the light, the lighting effects, about clouds, and capturing the strangeness of the physical world. Usually, again, just for a fleeting moment or so. Now, moving on with Cloar, that brings me to one of his most haunting literally paintings, and that is The Ghost from 1955. This is in a private collection, and it's a painting which, to me, is a little bit terrifying. It's, again, one of those very simple houses, the same type of house where Cloar probably grew up, just made out of milled lumber. Really nice bow tie quilt, provides this wonderful abstract foil for the kind of horrific figure who's down at the end of the bed. And his only kind of words about this was, "She came and stood at the end of the bed." I grew up with lots of ghost stories. I grew up in all sorts of creaky old houses. So this one I find particularly compelling. And again, I love the fact that this is Cloar, this very rational man who's not a believer, but instead is really delving into the psyche, into the unknown to make this incredibly compelling of this ghost image that was something I'm sure was based upon tales that he heard from his family, and thus is really based in his life experience. Now, of course, when it comes to ghosts, the most important of all the ghost paintings for Carroll Cloar is the Gibson Bayou anthology. This is also a very real place. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And this is another one of those instances where when I first started working on it, I was kind of flabbergasted that these are real people. These are people that Carroll Cloar knew. At left, just a little over from far left, is Ida Funkhauser. This is one of Carroll Cloar's mother's best friends, although she outlived her by 30 years or so. And Ida Funkhauser was apparently not a very physically attractive woman, but she thought that when she came into the bosom of Christ after her death, she would be not only spiritually beautiful, but she would become physically beautiful as well. And I always joke, well, this must be before her transformation with Christ, because she looks pretty stern and pretty plain there. Next over is Gabe Smith. He was someone who was killed by a neighbor who had a gun. They got in a dispute over a woman. The other neighbor pulled out a gun and shot him dead. So this is something else that Cloar heard about because Cloar wasn't born in 1902, but it's one of those tales that he grew up with. And then lastly is Oder Hayes. I feel sorry for that little girl with the name of Oder Hayes. She's at far right, kind of staring back at the viewer. Oder Hayes was someone that Cloar did know. She's kind of from the same time period as Cloar. And supposedly they both caught typhoid. Cloar survived typhoid and Oder did not, which is how she ended up in the Gibson Bayou Cemetery. And I have mentioned already that death was around Cloar all the time. So it's no surprise that it shows up in his work all the time. In looking at the Gibson Bayou anthology and its ghosts are based upon the lives of people Carroll Cloar knew, it's also interesting to keep in mind that this in turn was based upon, and it's really a visual homage to the work of Edgar Lee Masters, and particularly the Spoon River Anthology of 1915. And that's the collection of poems that tells about Spoon River, which is a town that Edgar Lee Masters invented, in which all the people who are buried in the cemetery stand up and they tell their story. And it caused a sensation was published because people in America had the idea that small town life was more pure, it was simple, it was honest. And what the ghosts in the Spoon River mythology tell is, of course, a very different tale of corruption and deception and lies and cheating. And it had a huge impact upon Carroll Cloar, as did many literary works. It's another one of the things you've seen quite often woven into his paintings. This really, really intelligent, keen mind that has incorporated literary motifs into his work. Now, Gibson Bayou anthology, as I already mentioned, is a real place, although very typically Cloar has distorted it considerably. And here, I'd like to give you a little bit of an example of how he put together a painting and talk about those types of distortion. Now, one of the things that Cloar was just supreme at is technique. He really understood the craft of making a painting. He was trained to do the very highest quality, and that's from years of work. He studied at a variety of places, but lastly at the Art Students League in New York City, where he was in the 30s and 40s. And there he learned various painting techniques. He preferred to work in case and tempera, and then later on he used acrylic. But one of the techniques he probably learned there was a French technique called décolcomania, or decolcomania, I guess you would say in English. And the image at left, which was the night before Christmas image I showed you at the very beginning, is one of these works which is made with decolcomania. To make a painting, Cloar started with a piece of masonite, the good old Home Depot masonite you can still buy today. Many artists used it. It was stable, it was inexpensive, it was widely available, and it was a really good ground for the type of painting Cloar liked to do, which was very fine and detailed. He would start this by covering it with a layer of gesso or very fine white plaster to give it a good bond. And then once he was finished with that, he would do the decolcomania technique, which is to slather the surface with paint, in this case, casein probably, or a milk-based tempera rather than an egg tempera. He would slather that on there, and then he would cover the surface with a piece of cloth or maybe plastic, smooth it out, and that would give it that kind of wrinkled, that kind of rippled effect. And you can see how this has those kind of fold lines in it from the cloth or the plastic. Once he was finished with that and it was dry, then he would transfer a finely finished drawing on top of that. And then once the transfer was complete, giving him the outlines of the composition which he'd worked out, he would start painting. Now, in the case of the Gibson Bio anthology, what he did, and he did very often in his paintings, was he allowed certain areas to bleed through. So when you look at the finished painting of Gibson Bio anthology, you'll see there's these kind of weird splotches of green. And I'm not talking about the very heavy, kind of newly dug grave areas, but instead around some of the gravestones and kind of creeping up into people's faces are these kind of vaporous passages which are green. And that's him allowing those greens underneath the main painting to kind of bleed through. And if you look at the original painting, you'll see it's not just greens, but there's pinks and all sorts of colors which are bleeding through there. And one of the things that it does is it really enhances the kind of otherworldly quality of this image of all these ghosts standing before their tombstones. The other reason I wanted to bring it up is decolcomania, which really relies upon the randomness of the natural world, was a technique that was quite often used by the Surrealists. And Cloar was interested in Surrealism. He wasn't a surrealist by any means because his works are always rooted in realism, but he's more of a magic realist than just a regular realist. But nonetheless, I think that again gives you a better idea of how rich the intellectual life of Cloar was and how he drew continually upon just a variety of different sources. Now, moving on, I wanted to again emphasize that Carroll Cloar was not the only artist who was interested in the ghostly. There were many of the magic realists who were also interested in capturing the other world. One of my favorites is Marvin Cohn, and this shows, of course, Carroll Cloar's Gibson Bio anthology at left, but in the center, that's Marvin Cohn's Ghost from 1938. It's one of several ghost paintings he did, and you can see how it has kind of a kinship with Cloar in kind of its molded surface, but the ghost here is much more kind of disembodied and much more shadowy and strange. And then at far right is a painting that always horrified me and fascinated me at the same time as a child. This is Ivan Lorraine Albright's The Picture of Dorian Gray. This was actually made for the movie, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which came out, I think, also in 1945. But it's a major work by magic realist artist. And you can see that in this case, you have all the corruption, all the grotesque things that are kind of creeping out of the surface of the picture of Dorian Gray, all the things that the real Dorian Gray didn't want to admit to. So it's not a ghost so much, but again, it shows there were a lot of artists during this time period kind of fascinated by this. And I always wonder, why is Cloar fascinated? And why Marvin Cohn and why Lorraine Albright and all the other artists who were working in this kind of genre. And I realized that they were living through, first of all, the Great Depression, and death was around you all the time then. And then perhaps even more so, the World War II period. Cloar was an active participant in the Second World War, as were many of the artists, had to deal with death all the time. And then after that, they had the Cold War to deal with. So there were a lot of fears. And I think exploring this imagery helped them kind of come to terms with the very real fears they faced every day of their lives. Now, cemeteries show up over and over in the works of Carroll Cloar. Sometimes they're kind of wooded areas with trees, and they're kind of abandoned, but quite often cemeteries show up as a major motif in his work. For instance, here is the tryst, where you have apparently two lovers who are seated in front of a tombstone, kind of torn, I guess, between death and desire. This is a great image also, which shows Cloar's use of decolcomania. You'll notice that molted surface, which is all over the field. It's bleeding through the skin, the figures, and even up in the sky, suggesting how he's using that random effect to enhance the kind of strange spiritual quality of the painting. Um, As Clore evolves as an artist, I think he understands his clientele really well and starts producing things which he knows will sell. I think his works also tend to get a little more mellow, a little more sweet, and I can't help but love this painting. I'm a sucker for dogs of all kinds, and this is not just any dog, but this is our Charlie. I don't know anything about our Charlie. I think it was a dog who actually lived in northern Mississippi. I think he saved a child, and so there's this wonderful monument of our Charlie, and then apparently the family, maybe the family of the little girl he saved, kind of spread around him. But as you can see, it's a very sweet scene, and it lacks the kind of gravitas that we've been looking at in most of the pictures so far. And indeed, when you put it next to Gibson Bioanthology, there's about 30 years between them. I think it's very clear the direction that Clore is headed, again, towards something which is a little sweeter, a little more mellow, and something that I think his clientele really wanted. I don't know how many of you would want Gibson Bioanthology staring at you every day if you had it in your home. I personally would love it, but I think it'd be a little disconcerting. And I think Clore again understood what people wanted. They wanted these beautiful lyrical images of the South. He was able to paint those, and he did very well. Nonetheless, even later in his career, he occasionally paints one of these very powerful, very mysterious paintings associated with graveyards or the afterlife. In this case, we're looking at The Last of the Wooldridges from 1982, about 10 years before his death. This is also a real place. It's in Kentucky. This is a monument that was put together by Mr. Wooldridge when all the other heirs, all the other people he planned to inherit his fortune died. He just kept adding statues of them. In this case, Carroll Cloar based this on a photograph he took in Kentucky and then added this little girl as kind of I think, to lighten the scene, but nonetheless, this very powerful, very mysterious image. Now, that brings me to, I think, what was really the impetus, the inspiration for doing this talk, one of Carroll Cloar's most terrifying and most powerful works. This is, of course, Halloween from 1960, which is in the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art. Here again, decolcomania. What you see in the moon is that other paint layer bleeding through. He's blacked or blocked out all the rest of the decolcomania in the sky. You can see that's just kind of a uniform gray. But in the foreground, he's allowed it to bleed through in the grouse. He's painted, strokes of white and gray over that to suggest the grass. And in the figure of the little girl herself in her skirt, you can see it's bleeding through there. And in the mask she's wearing. So ostensibly, this image is just about Halloween, but of course, with Clore, particularly with those really powerful works, it has much deeper meaning. It's worth noting, for instance, that the girl is wearing a plague mask. A plague mask was something that was used in Venice in the 18th century to conceal the identity of people who were picking up bodies of people who had died during the plague. So it's a mysterious mask, but it's also very sinister. The moon itself, as you can see, is kind of diseased, kind of cancerous. The house in the background, which is a real house that used to stand in Evening Shade, Arkansas, I believe it's since been demolished. You'll notice that it has mysteriously no door that's been covered over, so there's no way to get in there. It also looks, like it's been abandoned. And then most troubling, of course, are the figures in or immediately adjacent to the house, which Clore himself was disappointed that many people didn't realize what they were. And I suspect that people did recognize what they were, but didn't want to admit that they knew what they were. And those, of course, were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Crittenden County was very strongly associated with that terrorist organization. Crittenden County also, unfortunately, had a really terrible situation in regard to lynching and disappearances of African Americans. And Clore was deeply troubled by this heritage, and he kind of visits it several times in his career. But I think this is probably the most powerful of these images associated with it. And I also have to wonder, he didn't say what inspired him to paint this directly, but I can't imagine that there was any clientele that would be willing to have purchased this. Again, it was painted around 1960, and you have to imagine it was painted against the backdrop of what was happening with the civil rights movement. not just with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but with all the problems that were noticed in Arkansas as far as sharecropping in the 1920s and 1930s and the really violent history there. So it's a powerful, strange painting. And it's one that also, I think, really is about how children can so easily absorb negative influences. And the little girl's just cavorting around, but she's put on that mask, and it's almost as if she's starting to mimic that cowardly behavior. Now, Cloar here wasn't just dreaming this up himself. He was also looking at the work of other artists who were active during that time. I think in particular, I'm sure he was influenced by the work of Ben Shahn, and this is Ben Shahn's Peter and the Wolf from a little bit before Cloar's time. But Ben Shahn was actually represented by Edith Halpert, who was Cloar's first dealer. And when you look at the work of the two artists across the board, there are very strong correspondences. And here, I think we're also looking at images which deal with children and how quickly children can absorb deception, they can absorb deceit, and bad influences, particularly from parents or following poor examples. So I think that here Cloar wasn't just looking back in time, centuries past, but was also deeply influenced and reacting towards the work of other artists. Now, Ben Shahn is a particularly interesting character for Carroll Cloar. He was a social realist. He was trying to use his art to affect social change, as I think in many cases Carroll Cloar was too. But what's also interesting is Ben Shahn was actually, during the 1920s, when Cloar was quite young, in his teens, was actually in northwestern Arkansas. He was in Mark Tree, Arkansas, which is right up the road from Earl. And I have no record that the two ever met, but I can't help but wonder if they didn't have conversations at some time about that. And Ben Shahn was in northern Arkansas for social justice. He was trying to make posters and paintings about the plight of southern very poor farmers, sharecroppers, both black and white. Now, Cloar was also almost certainly influenced by other painters of the Magic Realist school, one of whom was Huey Lee Smith. And here I pulled kind of at random one of Huey Lee Smith's images called Conflict. And you can see that it has a lot in common with what's going on in Carroll Cloar's work. Huey Lee Smith was African American. He was, I think, from South Carolina, but really made his career in the North, where, of course, he had more opportunities and greater freedom. But both Huey Lee Smith and Carroll Cloar have a lot of correspondences as far as what they lived through, where they were living, and also their approach to using these really strange, powerful, magic realist images to affect social change, to try and change people's opinion about the treatment of those who have been unjustly treated. So, moving on, that brings me to one of the really iconic images of Carroll Cloar, and that's, of course, Where the Southern Crossed the Yellow Dog from 1965. This was the first work by Carroll Cloar I ever saw. I didn't grow up with Carroll Cloar around. I went for my job interview at the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art, I don't know, like in 2004 or something. And the day before I had my job interview, I went into the museum and looked at this, and I was just stunned by the power and the beauty of it. And my wife was with me, and I said, I don't think I've ever heard of this woman. And she looked over my shoulder and she's like, God, that is a powerful picture, and that was not painted by a woman. And she pointed out that it's Carroll with two L's. I'm like, oh, of course it wasn't. And this is, of course, one of his iconic works. The thing that fascinates me about this is it's such an image that communicates, at least to me, the small town in everyone. If we didn't grow up in that small town, somebody did. We have memories of there, and it's so much about homecoming. And yet, at the same time, this was done in 1965. I think there's a great sense of longing and mourning there about the plight of African Americans in Memphis and in the South. And it's an image that, at least to me, speaks of departure as well, of the Great Migration, of people leaving, going north, of African Americans going north to avoid prejudice, but also to move beyond lack of opportunity for them. This, to me, is just a beautiful painting in so many ways. And when I first looked at it, I had not realized how complicated it is. And every time I see it now, though, I look at the foreground and I see all those molted areas. And those are the fold marks of decolcomania. That's the heritage of his interest in surrealism. And then I look at that kind of shimmering, beautiful tree, which is impossible. Trees don't really look like that. And yet sometimes briefly they do. And realize that's the ties, of course, to magic realism. And then one of the things that I love so much about Carroll Cloar is how it really relates to the Mid-South. And this ties him, of course, to the regionalists, to the great artists of the 1920s and 30s, who were really celebrating the rural aspects of the United States. And of course, that's Thomas Hart Benton, um, Grant Wood, and John Stewart Curry, each associated with Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa. And so to me, it always makes sense. Well, of course, you have to give that legacy to Cloar because he's adjacent just a little further south in Arkansas. And it has that kind of shimmering quality that I associate with heat in the very late summer and the fall of the Delta. Again, a glorious picture and one much more complicated than you might think when you first see it. And that brings me to another one of the great icons in the history of Carroll Cloar's work, and that's, of course, the historic encounter between E.H. Crump and W.C. Handy on Beale Street. Now, this is a painting which was done right around the time of the civil rights movement in Memphis. And of course, that was kind of the epicenter of the civil rights movement because of the momentous and terribly tragic events which happened there. And Carroll Cloar, I think, made this in an attempt to bring people together. It's a metaphor, of course, for peace, and it's that moment where, which never happened, between E.H. Crump, Boss Crump, who ran the city, who was, kind of the leader of the pack as far as powerful white men, and W.C. Handy, the great musician, bringing together all these prominent white businessmen and social leaders on Beale Street. And again, I think it's meant as this kind of great way of linking these people together. And I love it particularly because not only is it based upon Cloar's study of all these local characters, based upon photographs he took when he visited Beale Street, but also because here again we have Cloar dipping into his bag of tricks. If you look in the background on the facades on either side of the Daisy Theater, you'll see the decolcomania, that kind of random, beautiful molded pattern associated with the surrealists. You also get that fleeting strangeness of the moment associated with the magical realists. But what I really love about it is how clever Cloar was in incorporating something religious, something spiritual and otherworldly into it. And that's because he staged this historic meeting of people who never actually met like this on Beale Street in front of that half niche or that niche on the theater. And I immediately recognized that because my own training in Renaissance art as the type of niche or an apse niche that you would find in a Roman Catholic church, and particularly during the Renaissance. And I'm sure that Cloar was looking at something like Piero della Francesca's The Montefeltro altarpiece, which dates, of course, 100 years earlier, but it shows the Virgin and Child in front of one of these niches, which beautifully echoes what's happening over in Cloar's painting. And what I find particularly compelling about that is the type of painting that Piero della Francesca was making here is called a sacra conversazione, or literally a sacred conversation. Sacred conversations usually focus upon the Virgin Mary and Christ, surrounded by saints and donors of all different time periods, people who could not have known each other in the physical world, but exist in this spiritual world where they've come together to kind of meditate, to have this conversation about peace, about harmony, about sanctity. And I think that Cloar was so fascinating in his ability to tie this into the work. Um, Again, Cloar was not a person of faith, but I think he fully understood the power of spirituality, and he really understood how to take the trappings, how to take the mechanics of faith, of Christian faith or other faiths, and fold them very powerfully into these images, which again, when you first look at them, don't look that complicated, but the more you understand them, the more you realize what really, really profoundly complicated and meaningful images they are. Now, I mentioned already that Cloar, at least in my view, over time kind of mellowed and became more attuned to the market and tended to make images which were a little bit sweet. But occasionally he produced an incredibly powerful work even within this genre. And the very last image I wanted to show you was one of my favorite Cloar paintings. I tend to like the Cloars from the 1950s and 60s. Those are the really edgy ones. Those are the ghosts, those are the cemeteries. Those are the ones associated with the civil rights movement when you get into the 60s. They're the ones that really have power. And I particularly love the ones associated with social change. But as I said, even towards the end of his life, and this is just 5 years before his death, he'll produce incredibly evocative works. And this is called What Charlie May Dreamt. Charlie May, of course, Charlie May Brown was one of his childhood friends. She lived in the same area and she was his playmate. And she dreamt this just beautiful image, this vision of the peaceable kingdom. And of course, this is a Christian image or the Christian theme, which has been repeated over and over. And in this case, Cloar has made an evocation of it with Charlie May seated and Cloar himself at this little stump table, and they're sitting on rounds of wood on logs, eating watermelon. And who's sitting with them but the panther? And panthers haunted Cloar as a child. They show up all the time, usually associated with with violence or the suggestion of violence. And then surrounding them are these other creatures who kind of come out from the forest. Again, it's just this lovely lyrical image, but when you start looking more carefully at it, a lot of the really powerful lessons Cloar borrowed from looking at art of the centuries and his compatriots are echoed here as well. So again, this was the final image I wanted to show you because I think it speaks so beautifully as to how Cloar was able to meld these images of the Delta, of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi into these just profound images that speak very gently of both the strangeness and the beauty of the everyday world, but also the way that art can affect positive change.